Once again, we'll turn to Matthew chapter 5. We're looking at verses 21 through verse 48. Could easily spend well over a year on these verses. What we said when we started this series that we weren't going to do that, and we're not. We're going to go through it pretty quickly. Not going to dwell on a lot of places where we could. But in verse 20, remember that much of the audience were the Pharisees. He tells the people that the righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. That righteousness which exceeds, of course, is Christ's righteousness put to our account. And as we said last week, the law does not bring or produce righteousness. That was never the intent of the law. If you go over to Galatians chapter 3, the doctrine of Gnosticism was prevalent in the churches of Galatia, which basically was you had to keep the law in order to be saved. And he says here in verse 1, O foolish Galatians, talking to the believers, who hath bewitched you, that ye should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ hath been evidently set forth, crucified among you? This only would I learn of you. Received ye the Spirit by the works of the law, or by the hearing of faith? Are you so foolish? Having begun in the Spirit, are you now made perfect by the flesh? Again, it must be consistent all the way through. So the law does not produce righteousness. Having said that, the imputed and imparted righteousness of Christ compels us to obey the commands of God, gives us a desire to obey the commands of God. The individual obeys the law because they have been made righteous in Christ. So Christ is the motive. Righteousness is not the motive. The motive is Christ. And this life that we're talking about, that is presented and illustrated in the Sermon on the Mount, is the motive of it is Christ. That's the motive. It is a righteousness that impacts the way we live. That's the righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. So in verses 21 through 48, what Christ is doing is he is presenting a higher standard than the letter of the law. He takes it further. He's presenting a higher standard. And in this section of the Sermon on the Mount, he addresses 6 topics. Each one we could spend a lot of time on. Murder, adultery, divorce, truthfulness, retaliation, and love. He addresses those 6 topics. In doing so, he reveals that he's not interested in a mere theoretical righteousness. He's not interested in an abstract holiness. The life that we're called to live, the life that is presented and illustrated in the Sermon on the Mount, is a result of a transformed life. And this transformation is a change in the essence of our being. And if you remember, that's where we started with the Sermon on the Mount, the so-called Beatitudes. You have to be something in order to live this life. And which again puts you beyond the scribes and the Pharisees. So our manner of living is to be the manifestation of a transformed life. We've been transformed in salvation. And now the life that we are to live is the manifestation of a transformed life. It doesn't bring transformation. Keeping the law does not bring transformation. It's the manifestation that a transformation has taken place. So, in this section of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus illustrates how this transformation manifests itself in these 6 aspects of life. So in this section, Christ is expounding on obedience to the law of God. And by doing so, he further stresses the importance of obedience to God. So in this section, he's expounding upon basically what true righteousness looks like, what it looks like in life. This is what it will do. This is how it will be manifested in one's life. The Christian life, the life that we're called to live, the life presented and illustrated in the Sermon on the Mount, is living out God's workmanship. Notice in Ephesians 2, very familiar verse, verse 10. Ephesians 2, verse 10. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus, unto, this is what this workmanship leads to, good works, which God hath before ordained that we should walk in them. Obedience to the law is a manifestation of God's workmanship in us. So it is a life suitable to what God has done within us. Obeying the laws of God, obeying the commands of God, is suitable to the life that God has created in us. So what God has done in our lives, in salvation, is to carry over into the way that we live. So the workmanship of God within a person does not lead that person to neglect the commands of God, does not lead that person to neglect the prohibitions of God, nor does it look for ways around the commandments of God. People will profess salvation and they will spend a lot of time looking for loopholes around obedience. And I assure you that the workmanship of God does not create that. That's not the workmanship of God. The workmanship of God has respect for whatever God commands, has respect for whatever God prohibits, and does not look for ways to get around obedience. So the workmanship of God within a person leads that person to desire to obey and to have the attitude behind the commandment. Because what Christ illustrates here in these verses is there's an attitude behind each command. Behind each command, behind each prohibition. So it's extremely important concerning the law of God, concerning obedience to the law of God, that we realize some very basic truths. First of all, as we've already said, we have to be something. God has had to perform a work within us in order to obey these things. We need to realize that the law is spiritual in nature. Notice in Romans chapter 7. Romans chapter 7, verse 14. For we know that the law is spiritual. The law is spiritual. That's its nature. But I am carnal. Therein lies the problem. You have a spiritual law, and you have a carnal man sold under sin. The law is spiritual. What does that mean? Someone will say, well, it teaches spiritual truths. Well, that's true, but it has to mean more than that. It means that the law reaches the inward as well as the outward. Mere outward obedience is not necessarily obedience. There can be rebellion raging inside, but the person has been taught to obey. So the law is spiritual. It affects the entire being of man. It affects the whole man. It concerns the will. It concerns the affections. It concerns the mind. It concerns the attitude. So it is the heart as well as the outward life. So to live to the neglect of these things, of the inward, to live to the neglect of the inward is disobedience. Someone will say, well, I've never killed anybody. But you did the things that lead to that, so you're guilty. Not guilty of killing them, but you haven't fully obeyed the command. So, the law is spiritual. Paul says, I am carnal. That is, the passions and propensities of flesh oppose the law. And Christ expands it. He expands it. So, also, not only is the law spiritual, but the law is inclusive of matters beyond the letter of the law. Whatever sin is forbidden, whether it be the Ten Commandments or the overall moral law of God. The Ten Commandments is basically a summary of the moral law of God. But whatever sin is forbidden, the contrary duty is implied. The contrary duty is commanded as well. And whatever duty is commanded, the contrary is forbidden. The law is inclusive. So, for example, when God forbids that we have other gods before Him, He at the same time is commanding us to worship Him as the one and only God. So yes, He forbids us to have other gods. But included in that is the opposite. You are to worship Him as the only God. When He forbids the profaning of His name, He is also requiring that we esteem and reverence His name. So someone could say, well, I haven't profaned His name, but have you reverenced it? Because it includes that as well. We can't get too narrow of a view of obedience. Also, whatever sin is forbidden, all of the same kind is forbidden as well. 8 of the 10 commandments are stated in the negative. 2 in the positive. Remember the Sabbath day, that's a positive. And honor thy mother and thy father. Or thy father and thy mother. So 8 are in the negative, 2 are in the positive. The 8 stated in the negative imply the positive, and the 2 stated in the positive imply the negative. So whether in the negative or the positive, the laws of God are absolutes. They're absolutes, just like the authority of God. So the law is spiritual. The law, that is, it affects the entire being of man. The law is inclusive. There isn't anything outside of the law of God. There's nothing outside of God's commands and prohibitions. The law of God also proclaims God's dominion and God's authority. These are important to remember in living a life of obedience. God is the supreme authority. And there is not anything that God does not have absolute authority over. You and I may think, well, that doesn't matter. God has authority over all things. And He has that authority by right because He is God. The truth that we must recognize in every aspect of our life is that God is the authority. And it's His right. It's His right. God has absolute and universal claim upon us, upon everything about us, upon everything in our life. He has absolute universal claim, and that's unlimited. That's unlimited. We must realize those truths about the law. So, to illustrate this, Christ addresses these 6 topics that relate to everyday life. A righteousness that relates to everyday life. A righteousness that relates to everything is what Christ is presenting. So what He does throughout these verses, as we saw last week, there's a pattern. He first states the letter of the law. He does that in verse 21, verse 27, verse 31, verse 33, verse 38, verse 43. What do we mean by the letter of the law? Well, the letter of the law is the literal interpretation. The literal interpretation. When the speed limit sign says 25, that is the letter of the law. That's the letter of the law. It is the interpretation, the literal interpretation. It can mean nothing else. That's it. He then goes on, after he states the letter of the law, he immediately follows and he states the spirit of the law. Verse 22, but I say unto you. Verse 28, but I say unto you. And that's how he introduces each one. But I say unto you. You have heard that hath been said, what follows is the letter of the law. But I say unto you. Doesn't undo the letter of the law, but he's expanding upon it. He's given us a better understanding. So the spirit of the law is really the intention behind the law. It's the principles behind the law. So when it comes to obedience to God's law, the concern of God's people reaches beyond the letter of the law. And that's what Christ is teaching. He's teaching that true righteousness goes beyond the letter of the law. true righteousness recognizes the full intent of the law. So, in addressing both the letter and the spirit of the law, he is teaching that the law goes beyond mechanical formality. Goes beyond that. The Pharisees don't want to hear that, because they're all into the mechanical and the formality. But what Christ is teaching is the law goes beyond those things. You can have the formality down perfectly. It appears that way. And be in direct disobedience to the law. He's teaching that obedience encompasses life. And that it's more than just a set of rules. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery. It goes beyond that. It encompasses life. He's teaching that obedience goes beyond the obvious act to the inward thoughts, to the motives, etc. He's teaching that the object of the law is not merely to prohibit, but to promote right behavior. So when he says, thou shalt not kill, he's not merely prohibiting killing. He is, but it's more than that. He's promoting right behavior. He's promoting right behavior. So, again, Christ addresses 6 topics. First, the letter, and then he expands upon the letter and addresses the deeper matters concerning the law. So in this section, verses 21 through 48, but I say unto you, 6 times he says that, but I say unto you. So in this section, he is, again, expanding, he's placing the emphasis. The emphasis is, but I say unto you. He states the letter, and then he emphasizes, but I say unto you. So the emphasis is the spirit of the law. Now this life that we're called to live, the life illustrated in the Sermon on the Mount, involves other people. And everything he mentions, the 6 topics that he mentions, every one of them involve other people. Every one of them. So, to live this life, we have to relate to other people. We have to have a proper behavior toward other people. So he starts out, verse 21, verses 21 through 26, and he's speaking on the subject of murder. The law is stated, the letter of the law is stated in verse 21. Then the spirit of the law is expounded upon in verses 22 through 26. The letter of the law is, thou shalt not kill, which is the 6th commandment, stated in Exodus 20, verse 13. And we could spend a lot of time on that, but we're not going to. It requires an overall respect and value of human life, and the life we're called to live. Involves a respect and a value upon human life. Thou shalt not kill means also that we seek to preserve life. So after stating the letter of the law, he then states the penalty for breaking this commandment. Whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. This is a brief summary of what he states in Numbers chapter 35, verses 16 through 21, where he very clearly states the death penalty for murder. The spirit of the law, verses 22 through 26, but I say unto you. Here Christ explains the requirements of the command go much deeper than the command itself. The requirements go much deeper than the actual committing of murder. So Christ shows here that murder is not merely an outward act, but it proceeds from an inward feeling. It is a result of the sinful nature of man. Notice in Matthew 15, Jesus states this truth. Matthew 15 and verse 19. For a little background, the Pharisees, they're upset because the apostles didn't wash their hands, and Christ is addressing all of this. He says, "For out of the heart proceed." Here's what comes from the heart. Evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man. But to eat with unwashed hands defileth not a man. So what is the problem? In verse 19, what is the problem? Is the problem evil thoughts? Is the problem murder? Is the problem adultery? Is the problem fornication, thefts, false witness, blasphemies? No, the root problem is the heart. And that's what Christ addresses, is the heart. You fix the heart, these other things are fixed as well. So, when Christ states the spirit of the law, he's stating an issue of the heart. So if we go back to Matthew 5, verse 22, "But I say unto you, that whosoever is angry with his brother." So he warns against anger. He's speaking upon the subject of murder. And he warns against anger. Here in the first part of verse 22, it's anger without a cause. In other words, it's anger that's unwarrantable. It's inward anger. It is Ephesians 4, verses 31 and 32. They're put away these things, wrath, bitterness, so on. He goes on in verse 22, "Whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of judgment, and," something else now, "whosoever shall say to his brother, Reka, shall be in danger of the council." So this is an expression of anger. It's an expression, he's warning against scorn here, which is a branch of anger. And then in the last part of verse 22, "But whosoever shall say, Thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire." Here he's warning against reviling, abusive language. So you abuse someone verbally, and you can say, "Oh, I didn't kill them." No, you didn't. But that abusiveness could lead to that. And this is what Christ is expanding upon. He says, you didn't kill someone, but you were angry without a cause, you hated them without a cause. You're guilty. You're guilty. Not guilty of murder, but you're guilty. You've broken the law. You have not fully carried out the law. And then he goes on in verses 23 through 26, and he encourages a readiness for reconciliation. someone who refuses to be reconciled, to have another person reconciled to them. Well, I haven't killed anybody. No, but you haven't fully obeyed either. And that's what he addresses there in verses 23 through 26. The next subject he deals with is verses 27 through 30. He deals with adultery. The letter of the law stated in verse 27, "Ye have heard that it was said of them of old time, Thou shalt not commit adultery." That's the letter of the law. The spirit of the law is stated in verses 28 through 30. The letter of the law is, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." That's the seventh commandment stated in Exodus 20, verse 14. It has reference, of course, to unfaithfulness to the marriage bed, includes all sexual sins, sins of the same kind, includes all sexual sins, all sexual perversions. It stresses the importance of sanctity, the importance of purity. It is a command that protects happiness and long-lasting family relationships. Again, we could spend a lot of time on this. The spirit of the law, verses 28 through 30, goes beyond the mere injunction, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." It takes us beyond that. So he reveals the extent of the law. Verse 28, Matthew 5, verse 28, "But I say unto you," so he's revealing the extent of this. This is how far we're going to carry this. It goes beyond the mere physical act. He says, "But I say unto you, whosoever looketh on a woman to lust," he looks with that purpose, "looketh on a woman to lust after her, he hath committed adultery with her already in his heart." And out of the heart flows what? The physical action. The physical action. So it extends to the desires. It extends to the heart. One may never commit the physical act, but it goes further than the physical act. It extends to the desires of the heart. So it prohibits all forms of sexual impurity. It prohibits all forms of indecency. It would prohibit anything that moves in that direction, the direction of committing adultery. Anything that would encourage it is prohibited here. Anything that would stimulate, anything that would encourage and stimulate lust and desire is prohibited in this command. It would include immodest dress. That's included there because it leads to these things and encourages. It encourages lust. It leads to improper touching. It includes pornography, and on you could go. All of these things. Well, I didn't commit the physical act. That may be so. But you haven't fully obeyed. Because the command goes further than just the letter. It reveals, in verses 29 through 30, he reveals the seriousness of sexual impurity. "And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out. Cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and that thy whole body should be cast into hell. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off. Cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and that thy whole body should be cast into hell. Now this is in the context of adultery. It's in the context of sexual impurity. He says in verse 29, he says in verse 30, he uses the word offend. Offend. It appears in both of those verses. And what it means is to cause to stumble. To cause to stumble. He says, if there is a part of you that is going to cause you to stumble in this area, get rid of it. It's not you're not to literally pluck out your eye, but he's showing the seriousness of it. If there's a part of you that is heading in this direction, you need to take measures to get rid of it. Anything that would cause you to stumble. Someone says, well, I can look at nakedness, it doesn't mean a thing to me. You're a liar. That's just not so. And it leads to these things. So the words pluck out the right eye, cut off the right hand is figurative, but it teaches a literal truth. All figurative language in the Bible teaches literal truth. People will say, well, that's figurative. It doesn't mean anything. Oh, it means a lot. It's figurative, but it teaches literal truth. And what is being taught here is the solemn duty to suppress, the solemn duty to strive earnestly against all occasions to sin. In the direct context, he's referring to sexual sins, but you could take it beyond that. And the lengths that we ought to be willing to go to restrain and govern the desires of the flesh. And yet today there are people who profess to be saved, who will defend, who will try to defend the things that move in the direction of sin. And rather than defending them, they ought to be doing everything they can to restrain and govern the desires of the flesh. And then one more for tonight. We come to verse 31 and 32. You have the subject of divorce. The Old Testament principle is laid out in Deuteronomy 24. Again, we're not spending time on these things. The letter of the principle is verse 31. It has been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. Let him give her a writing of divorcement. That's the letter of the law. Christ addresses this. Notice over in Mark chapter 10. He also does it in Matthew 19, but we'll look at Mark 10. Mark 10. Verse 1, and he rose from thence and cometh in the coast of Judea by the farther side of Jordan, and the people resort unto him again as he was wont, and he taught them again. And the Pharisees came to him and asked him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife? And they asked him this to tempt him. And he answered and said unto them, what did Moses command you? And they said, Moses suffered, or Moses permitted, to write a bill of divorcement and to put her away. Jesus answered and said unto them, he's going to tell them why this was permitted. For the hardness of your heart, he wrote you this precept. Now again, we're not going to get into all the details. And then in verses, so he addresses the reason for this law, the hardness of man's heart. And then he goes on in verses 6 through 9, and he states God's standard for marriage. He says, but from the beginning of the creation of God, made them male and female. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife. That's something that's lost today. Leave and cleave, leave and cleave, leave and cleave. Let them leave and cleave. Don't try to stop that. The word cleave means stick together. It means stuck together. In other words, you're stuck. You're stuck together. And here's how stuck they are. They, though they be two, shall be one. One flesh. So then that they are no more twain, but one. What therefore God hath joined together, connected together, united together, let not man put asunder. In other words, it's permanent until death. Romans chapter 7. So, he states God's standard for marriage, which is one of union and permanency. He, in Matthew 5, verse 32, he expands this even further. But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, and almost everybody, well, except for unfaithfulness. That's not what the verse says. That's not what it says. We're not going to get into it. It's tempting. Fornication. Fornication and adultery are two different things. Two different things. Fornication occurs before marriage. Keep in mind Joseph and Mary. Joseph and Mary. For the cause of fornication causeth her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her, that is divorced, husband gave a writing of divorcement, committeth adultery. So he carries it even further. But what this teaches us is that this life that we're called to live carries over into married life, carries over into home life. It all matters. It all matters. And if we're going to live this life that we're called to live, we have to realize it all matters. I mean, it should, when people say, well, it doesn't matter. Well, better talk to God about that. Because it does matter. It does matter how things are done. There's right, there's wrong. And it does matter. Doesn't matter what the time is, it matters. God has already stated His laws. Doesn't matter what the flow of society is, the opinions of man. That has no bearing upon what God has established. And if we're going to live this life, we have to keep these things in mind. Obedience is a very serious matter. It has to be done God's way. For it to be true obedience, it has to be done God's way. And God has stated His way. And if He has not stated it by the letter, there are principles. The Bible is a book of biblical principles. It's stated. It's there. It's there. For all who want to know, it's there. So God help us to take obedience very seriously. Because it is a serious matter. It's a serious matter. It doesn't get you to heaven, but it's a serious matter. And has everything to do with the life that we live. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us